and it's specifically directed towards Catholics, but I wanted to share it because I think it's applicable to all of us. And it says, one reason Catholics need to read the great books is because Aristotle, St. Augustine, and St. Thomas Aquinas will sound really foreign at first, but Machiavelli, Hobbes, and Locke will sound quite familiar. And just that tends to set off alarm bells about our present age. Basically what that means is that it's really the way moderns think about, specifically in this context, think about politics and how we interact socially versus the way the ancients and the medievals did is very different. And for us, it's really easy to fall into that modern category and to just take it. So this reading, for example, the reading for this week, it was some pretty hard stuff. One reason it's hard is because it's really technical and long and just difficult reading. But another reason is because even if you understand the ideas being presented, they're very different than what we're used to. And so that's also one of the reasons that I want us to do this, is because these are ideas that would have been extremely mainstream 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago, that for us sound totally foreign. And so I think that that in and of itself is a good reason to look at some of these ideas. So we'll get started, and I don't know if you can read this, but I'm guessing you can. And I saved this also several months ago because if anyone can guess, one of the things that I struggle with at school a lot is keeping with a word count. If someone says your max word count is 2,500 words, that is an extremely hard limit for me to keep with. And so I love this. This person had changed. If you read the reading for this week, you will recognize this bottom quote. It's someone had adapted a quote from the play Antigone, which was your first reading. You had a section, Antigone's monologue from Sophocles' play Antigone. And just to give you a brief insight into what that play is about, if any of you have ever heard of Oedipus, this is Sophocles' last play in his trilogy on Oedipus, and basically what happens is Oedipus leaves Thebes, and he leaves his two sons to be kings, and they're supposed to go back and forth. So the oldest brother is king in the first year, and the younger brother is king in the second year, and then they switch. And as you can probably guess, this doesn't last very long before one of the brothers decides, why do we have to switch? I'm just going to be king instead, the whole time. And his other brother is not a big fan of this. And so he goes off to Argos and raises an army and comes back and tries to take Thebes back. And they end up killing each other on the battlefield, and this play takes place right after that. And their uncle Creon becomes king, and he says, the one brother who stayed and fought for Thebes, we're going to bury him with all the honors. The other brother, we're going to leave, and we're going to let the birds pick at his body. And we're not going to bury him. In fact, he makes a law that says no one can bury him. His sister Antigone goes out and sprinkles dust on the body, and she gets arrested for it. And her uncle says, well, why did you do this? And she responds with this monologue, part of which says, yea, for these laws were not ordained of Zeus, and she who sits enthroned with gods below, justice, enacted not these human laws. Nor did I deem that thou, a mortal man, couldst by breath annul and override the immutable, unwritten laws of heaven. They were not born today or yesterday. They die not, and none knoweth whence they sprang. So why did I have you read this? One, because I really love classical drama. Two, because this is a really great early articulation of what's called natural law theory. And we'll get into this later, but natural law theory is in a really important way that Christians have thought about how do we articulate laws. Where do they come from, and how do we come up with them and apply them? And then, of course, we have Aristotle, who is Aquinas' big classical influence. And there's two ideas from Aristotle that are really important for this discussion. First, that the point of the political organization, the state, is not to, well, the main point, the reason it exists, is to make men good. And most of this, when we hear this, we freak out. That is an idea that Americans hate. It is really scary to most Americans, and really to most moderns. They're like, whoa, no. Like, the government's job is not to make people good. But that is a really important classical idea, and one that when we get to what Aquinas actually says, will be really helpful to understand that that's where he's coming from. And the second idea that he has is that the political community exists to be united around a shared conception of the good. So this is also a major shift from classical thinking to modern thinking. So modern thinkers like Hobbes or Locke or Machiavelli will say, the reason we come together is because we're all scared to death of each other, and we're worried that in the state of nature, if there's no government, at any moment we might wake up with a knife in our ribs because someone wanted to steal something from us. And so that's the reason that basically we construct all of these systems of laws and government and all of these things as a way to protect ourselves and from each other. That's the modern idea. And that's where things like, all right, we have rights, and so the government has to protect our rights and my rights and your rights and all that. That's modern thinking. The ancients would say, no, we come together because we all love the same thing, and we come together to further our ability to love that thing better. So now we'll get quickly to this idea. They'll come back, but there's 2 slides on things that are really important to understand before we can move on. The first one is the 4 classical virtues. You may have heard of these. We have justice, prudence, courage or endurance, and moderation. And these, they come right out of Plato, and they've stayed since then. And basically these are ideas that, particularly in the way that we engage with each other socially, there are 4 virtues that are key, and that all other virtues kind of fall into these categories. We have justice, which means something like, or justitia in the Latin, moral rectitude or fairness. Plato identifies this as having all of your actions lined up and directed in the right way. And then we have prudence, which is our ability to match the proper means of doing something to the proper things that we should be doing, or having the right actions for a certain situation. We have fortitude, which is the ability to persevere through difficulty, to do the right thing even when it's hard, and moderation, which is the ability to control our appetites or desires. And if anyone pays any attention to particularly popular culture, moderation is not a virtue of modern culture. It is not at all. And then we have types of reason. Now, we've talked some about speculative reason, which is, if you remember thinking back about the forms, that's speculative reason. Our ability to think about like abstract concepts like math or things like beauty or truth or all of those things. But we also have practical reason, which is, again, our ability to match proper means to proper ends. So when you get into a situation, you say, well, what's the right thing to do? Knowing the right thing to do is speculative reason. How you actually go about and do that, that's practical reason. So now we get into law itself. What is law? How does it work? Why do we need it? Well, Aquinas identifies law as a dictative reason. It's basically the way that in a given situation, we try to take a virtue and we say, how do we make this virtue applicable? How do we particularize it to a given situation? And the purpose of the law is to make men good by directing them towards an end. And it does this through the process known as habituation. And you see this, we do this with children all the time. If you have a child and you want them to do something, you have to make it so they do this thing constantly so it becomes second nature. You don't even have to think about it. If you want a child to, pick up their clothes, well then you have to keep getting on them to pick up their clothes. And eventually they will get to the point where they do it of their own, by themselves. They won't even have to think about it. It's natural. It's become second nature. It's ingrained in them. The ancients would see law as doing the same thing for us. We want people to have certain patterns of behavior to do the right thing. Well, law sets up the guardrails that keep us in the right path and help us do the right thing. Even if we don't want to at first, law, the threat of law, the threat of the punishment that comes with law helps us to do the right thing until eventually we don't even have to think about it, until it becomes natural to us. Now, we do have to draw a distinction between what we mean by good. We're not talking here specifically in a moral sense. I mean, we can be, so laws can make people good by getting them to do the right moral thing, but it also means good as in the law makes people good However, the lawgiver defines people being good. So if you have some guy and he runs a band of thieves, the training that he's going to give those thieves will make them really good thieves. That would be, in that sense, good law, good training. He's going to make them good for the end that he wants them to have. But it doesn't necessarily mean that then there is a moral good attached to that. We wouldn't say that being a good thief is somehow morally virtuous. And so that distinction is really important. There's also a distinction that Aquinas draws between infused virtue and acquired virtue. So we can acquire virtue, or at least virtuous patterns of behavior, through this process of habituation, by doing the thing over and over and over again until it becomes second nature. And then there's also infused virtue. And this is where a Christian thinker would kind of take a different approach than a classical thinker. See, like a classical thinker like Aquinas or Aristotle has no idea of infused virtue. There's no place for God's grace to come in and help us live how we're supposed to live. And so that's why the ancients were actually super pessimistic, because they say, yep, this is kind of the ideal, how we're supposed to live. Maybe 1, 2, 3 people in all of history might be able to hit that ideal. Maybe, if they're lucky. And that's it. So this ideal that they have, they're like, well, they got that no one can get that. And they're like, well, shucks. All right then. That's where we're at. And Christian thinkers say, no, you're right on the first part, but you're missing God's role in infusing in us the grace necessary to help us live the way that we're supposed to live. So Aquinas breaks down law into 4 categories. He says there's 4 types of law. The first one is the eternal law. And this is basically God's kind of rational master plan for how creation runs. It suffuses everything. If you hear people talk about God's providence, this can be equated with the idea of eternal law. Aquinas says that people don't know the eternal law in and of itself unless one sees God in his essence. When we talked about the beatific vision last week, that's what he's talking about. So like eternal law, it is part of, it's part of God. To see it, So God's plan for everything is built up, wrapped into his own nature, his essence, his being. And while we can't know that in this life, we can know it by reflection. We see the order and structure built into creation. We as rational creatures have consciences. We know when there are things that we do that aren't right. And so then we can see that, and we can try to do things that are going to line up with that. There's this quote, therefore all law, no, that's not the one I wanted. Yeah, there it is. At the bottom of the slide it says, therefore all laws, insofar as they partake of right reason, are derived from the eternal law. Basically, if we have eternal law is like the big overarching scope. So natural law, human law, divine law, all of those things, really human laws. Human laws, insofar as they partake in the eternal law, are derived from the eternal law and they're right. So one thing that Aquinas does a lot of is he does a lot of definitional nitpicking. So if you had a law that said it's okay to go out and steal your neighbor's car. In fact, the law is encouraging you to go out and steal your neighbor's car. That could have the name of a law, but it doesn't actually make it a law, Aquinas would say. He's going to say, no, because that's not fulfilling the purpose of law, it's not directing us towards virtue and towards the common good, it doesn't actually fit that category. So you can call it a law, it doesn't actually make it a law. And so all law, as it actually, to the degree that it is a law, is derived from the eternal law, and as we'll get to now, from the natural law. So the natural law is our human grasp of the divine order of creation, our ability to grasp things like good and evil, and our inclinations towards our proper acts and ends. Now, natural law is the same for all people, though the degree that we'll actually lock onto it is varied. So you could, there exist people for whatever reason, whose moral conscience is so warped that they, will not see something as wrong that everyone else will see as wrong. I mean, that's like a sociopath by definition. It is possible for something to be so wrong in them, so warped, that they don't have the ability to grasp good and evil. That doesn't mean that the natural law doesn't exist. It exists, our ability to grasp it differs. And while the natural law is the same for everyone, it doesn't mean that the conclusions that we're going to get from it are always going to be the same. So if you think of a natural law principle, so a common one that most natural law thinkers will say is, do harm to no man. That is kind of a fundamental natural law principle. What does that mean in a particular situation is going to be different. And it can be done in multiple ways and still be right. So if a conclusion that you can reach from that is that in town, in Saranac, our speed limit should be 25. That keeps us, that protects, that helps us not do harm to any people. But it could be 24, and that would still be okay. Or it could be 26, and that would still be okay. There's room for humans to make judgment calls, to use their practical reason to say, okay, here's our principle, here's how we actually apply it in real life. The principles that we get from the natural law are not equally known to everyone, and the proper conclusions that practical reason gets us to are not the same for everybody, nor are they equally known to everybody. So, if you have a situation, there are situations in human life where you can have more than one right answer. And you can have, so there can be more than one right answer. There can also be people that don't see any of the right answers. Both of those are, reasonable positions that happen. So to quote here, consequently, we must say that the natural law, as to its general principles, is the same for all, both as to its correctness and as to knowledge. But as to certain matters of detail, which are conclusions of those principles, it is the same for all in the majority of cases, both as to the rectitude and to the knowledge, and yet in some few cases it may fail, both as to rightness by reason of certain obstacles, and as to knowledge, since some of the reason is perverted by passion or evil habits or evil dispositions of nature. And so actually we'll save that example for next. All right, so now we move on to the human law. And the human law is what we think of as laws. So things that say, the law that says if you steal, don't steal, and then if you steal, here's the punishment that you're going to get. And these are particularizations from the mandates of natural law. And human law is only legitimate law to the degree that it conforms to natural law. Now, some of the laws that we have are conclusions from principles of the law. So things that say, do no harm leads us to say, then you shouldn't kill people. That's a direct relationship there. Not killing people is directly related to this idea of do no harm. But there's also ways in which we determine things from natural law. So natural law says, evildoers should be punished. The actual punishments are up to us to figure out. Natural law doesn't say, here's the crime, here's the punishment, and it's direct and it's the same in all contexts and for everybody. No, there's some contextualization work that's left up to us. So we already gave the speed limit example. I'll give another example that Plato gives in the Republic. So say you have a friend, and he lends you his gun, right? And he comes back 3 weeks later, and he is obviously not in his right mind. And he says, give me my gun back. Now, the natural law principle says, if someone gives you something that's theirs, then when they ask for it back, you should give it back. And that's true in most circumstances. Because obviously, if someone comes back and asks you for their gun, and they are obviously not in the situation where they should be having that, it is actually your duty to say no. This is, so there are ways in which, it's really important for us to be able to think through these things and say, well, yes, we should give back things that people lend us, but there are situations in which that actually does more harm than good. And so we have to be aware of that these principles are not universal for all times and all places. They're normative, meaning that in most times and places, they're the right thing, but they're not universal. It's not going to be the right thing every time and in every situation. Now, human laws are framed for the common good and for the common benefit because they regulate how we live together, socially. Now, Aquinas will say, when we have human laws, we can't use human laws to prohibit all vices. You've heard, I'm sure people have heard the expression, you can't legislate morality. Now, Aquinas isn't saying that. He's just saying that you can't legislate absolute morality. And there's two reasons that he gives for this. One, by prohibiting all vices, you may end up preventing some good. There are situations where if you were to step in, so here's an example from the classical world. And this actually applies, so the second reason he gives is that the laws have to be able to be followed by most people. You can't have a law that no one is ever going to be able to follow, because then how do you enforce that? That makes no sense. And so then one thing that is probably kind of shocking to us is that a lot of the church fathers and a lot of the medievals, one thing that they were not willing to say, yes, the law needs to prohibit this, is prostitution. And the reason for this is they say, well, one, how are we, the effort and the ability for us to stamp that out is just, it doesn't exist. We can't do it. But the second reason is that if we do that, are we then going to run into a situation where all of a sudden we have some massive spikes in things like assaults and rape and all these other bad things? They're saying, well, maybe we can't prohibit all the vices. Maybe we need to, some need to be tolerated, and not in a moral sense like we're saying that's okay, but in a saying that the law can't pick up that slack, that it needs to leave some space because, we're human, we're fallen. The law can't legislate absolute morality. Now, I'm not saying that conclusion was right. I'm just saying that is a conclusion that people have reached as they try to balance, okay, how much can the law encourage right activities, right ways of living, and how much do we have to leave space for human fallenness in the law? Our last type of law is divine law. So this is God's law. So if we talk about natural laws being revealed to us in the world and through our reason, we have divine law, which is God's direct, written, expressed law to us. And there are 4 reasons Aquinas says why we need this. The first one is that our end is not proportionate to our nature. If you remember last week when we talked about ends and natures, we talked about how most things, their end is proportionate to their nature. So like an acorn, if its end is to be an oak tree, nature, God provided in its nature everything it needs to go from being an acorn to an oak tree. But we don't have that. We can't save ourselves. So what God does is he personally directs us, steps in, provides the way for us to attain our end. And so that's why we need his direct revelation to us and why we need Christ's salvific work, because we don't have the ability to actually get to that step by ourselves. The second reason that God gives us the divine law is because we err and we're fallen. So to make sure that there's no confusion about what we're supposed to do and not to do, God gives us his will directly expressed. God knows that we can't get it all by ourselves. He knows that, there are probably some people that could get some of this stuff by themselves. And we talked about this in the very first lesson. But he also knows that there are plenty of us who are not going to get it and who aren't going to get it on every single thing. And so he steps in and gives it to us right there so there's no confusion. The third reason is that we can't judge interior acts. We can see someone's external actions, but we can't know what's going on in the heart. Lots of times we can't even know what's going on in our own. Now, human laws can step in and they can curb external acts, or at least punish external acts. You can be punished or prevented from committing a murder, but the law can't really step in and say, you wish this person ill in your heart. We know that, we found that out, and we're going to punish you for it. That's just not possible. And yet those things are wrong, as God's divine law says. And so the divine law has to step in and provides the way to curb and direct and convict our own internal actions, things that the external human laws can't do. And finally, as we talked about earlier, human laws can't forbid and punish every single evil. But we all know that every evil should be forbidden and punished. And so that's where the divine law steps in, to make sure that every evil act is prohibited and is punished. All right, so that's what we have on the 4 types of law and everything from the Summa. And we'll jump now into a little section that I gave you from the work called De Regno. And Aquinas wrote this for the young king of Cyprus, and this was like his how to be a good Christian king manual. And it's pretty interesting. And I picked just a couple of sections from the middle of the book, chapters 14 and 15. Aquinas says, "But it seems that the end of every organized society is to live a life of virtue. The reason we come together is to help each other to live the right way that we're supposed to live." And we see that now in this room. One of the reasons that we're here is to encourage each other, to help each other, to grow and to live as God has called us to live. Aquinas is going to expand that and say, that's the reason that we live in any kind of social organization, is to help each other live towards a certain end. Now, as he says in chapter 15, since the end of the good life is that we live on earth is the happiness of heaven. All right, I think most of us are tracking here so far. It is the duty of the king or any government to promote the good life and, as far as possible, forbid its opposite. This is where lots of people are going to fall off and say, hold on, back up a second. How did we get there? And here's how. Aquinas is going to say the king, as a ruler, if the end of the organization that he rules is to live in virtue, then the king has to make sure that society lives well. Now, to do this, he should establish the good life of the community. That's step 1. Make sure things are going well. Make sure people are living well. 2, defend it once it's established. And 3, foster its improvement. We all know that society isn't perfect. There may be many great things about, whatever particular society you live in. There are also plenty of things that are not so great. There's always room for us to be improving. But this, of course, does not lead to some sort of post-millennialism where we're like, okay, at some point, everything's going to be perfect, and we're great. This isn't some sort of utopian dream. This is actually a very concrete recommendation that says, look, there are problems. We know that there are some which we're able to try to make a little bit better, that we should be trying to make a little bit better. Now, Aquinas says for us to live a good life, there's 2 things. We have to live according to virtue, and we have to be sufficient in the material goods necessary for virtuous action. As we talked about last week, when we talked about different types of the good life, we had the Stoics who said, all you need is virtue, and we had the Aristotelians who said, well, all we need is virtue, but it really helps if you've got some other stuff to go along with it. If you're able, if you're not spending 24 hours, 7 days a week, all year scrounging for food and water, then you have time to worry about other things. And so it's important that we have at least some of these material goods met before we can deal some of these basic animal, human needs to keep our bodies alive before we can talk about some of this other stuff. And then he says, okay, well, that's for the individual. What is it for a community? He says there's 3 requirements for a good life of a social group. The first one is peace. All right? If there's anarchy, if you're constantly worried about, about dying or about there not being enough food or all of these, of this chaos, it's really hard for a social group to function well. Second, you have to be united towards acting well. This is the same idea that we exist as a community, directing to help each other live in a certain type of way. And third, we need the sufficient supply of our necessities. Basically, it's the same thing. We need to have our bodily needs met to be able to do some of this other stuff. So one thing, as a historian, people talk about the agricultural revolution. Basically what that means is that there reached a point when humans were able, things like government, culture, all of these kind of higher end human activities couldn't happen until humans reached the ability to get enough food where not everyone had to spend all day, every day, all year scrounging for food. That's the same kind of thing we're talking about here. We need to be, these basic needs have to be met. One of the things government has to do is help people meet some of these basic needs so that then they can go about doing the other things that we're supposed to do as we live socially. And that's all I have on this. Are there any questions or thoughts? This is probably one of the weirder, not weirder, but more unfamiliar topics that we would touch with, because this isn't the way that we're trained to think. We think that government exists to secure my rights and your rights when we come into conflict with each other. Say most of us say, other than that, government shouldn't be there. It just needs to exist to keep our rights from coming into conflict with one another. But the ancients would say, no, government actually exists. There's very little rights talk in the ancient world. There's a lot of talk about duties, the things that we owe other people, and there's a lot of talk about the way that government exists and society exists to help us reach towards a certain end. And a lot of this comes back to this idea we talked about, teleology, about thinking about things purposefully and what their purposes are. This is the kind of argument or thinking that you get about politics when you start with this idea that things have purpose and that things have ends that they're supposed to be directed towards. When we don't think about that, we get some very different ideas, the kind of ideas that most of us most of American society today lives with. The way that, we think about politics today is not teleological. It's heavily grounded in, 18th century rights talk. I'm not saying that all of that is bad. I would say that a lot of it is. I'm very anti-enlightenment, but that's my personal stance on that topic. But I think, if we think from a Christian perspective, we think that God creates everything, right? God sustains everything. God's sustaining power influences everything. One of the mottos or whatever at Calvin is every square inch, that God, there's not sections that we can section off and say, we'll give this to God, God doesn't get this part, or God doesn't, get to work in this part. Every square inch is open. In fact, needs to be open to God's work. And that includes things like thinking about how do we vote? How do we live in community with other people? These are really important questions that it's really easy for us to not think, or at least not think deeply about, okay, how does Christian faith influence that? How do we live that out? How do we get a cohesive system of thinking together about, how are we going to take our Christian principles here and apply it to this sector, to this sector, to this sector, without trying to, create this false division of, okay, I've got my Christian things over here, I've got everything else over here. And that's really hard because, as lots of us will, we'll hear talk about, well, we need, the separation of church and state. We have, or as most, so liberalism, which is kind of that's a political ideology that we live with. It comes out of the 18th century. So if you hear people talk about the liberals, usually to talk about people on the political left, that's one of those things where definitionally it's a little shaky, where actually pretty much everyone in modern political discourse would be identified as liberal, just because of this shared set of values, but that's neither here nor there. But one of the things is that it seeks to say, okay, you've got your personal stuff here, and you've got your public stuff here, and we need to separate those things out. Well, I say that that's not possible. I've written some stuff for school on that. It's not possible for us to take our convictions on any sort of question and say, okay, I'm gonna keep that in the home, and then that doesn't then flow out into the way that I live with the world. That's not possible. And no one lives like that. It doesn't matter, Christians and non-Christians alike have convictions that then get played, personal convictions that get played out in the public sector. One of the reasons is just because we have to have a frame of reference to be able to do anything. But the other reason is that if you are convinced, rightly or wrongly, that what you believe is correct, then you should want, so if we believe that Christianity has the answers on things like human anthropology, on things like sin, on right and wrong, good and evil, then it follows that should lead us to engage with the world in a different way than someone that has a different view on those things. And if we think that those views are right, then there's a reason that we should work, then we believe it would seem to follow that those things would make life here on earth for believers and non-believers a little bit better. So an example would be, okay, if Christians think, if the Bible says that we need to look out for the poor and the dispossessed and the orphan, then that means that supporting untrammeled and, to take care of the world that God's given us, then untrammeled consumer capitalism is probably not something that Christians, should be cheering with open arms. I'm not saying that you should not be a capitalist or you should be a capitalist. What I'm saying is that there are, what was I saying with this? That's a good question. Suffice it to say, it means that it should give us a different outlook. So if we take these principles, it should give us a different way of looking at how are we going to kind of make those principles work in the real world. And I guess the thing I want to close with is that there's a lot of temptation for Christians to withdraw from the world, to say the world is messy, the world is broken, the world is, it doesn't like us. And it's really easy for us to say, well, that means I'm going to step back. I'm going to keep myself unspotted by the world. I'm not going to, I'm going to pull back and not deal with it. We'll let those other people handle it. They can deal with it how they want. I'm going to stay out here. But that's not the call that we get. The call we get is to go into all the world, first with the gospel, but also with the way that our beliefs then necessarily flow into how we live with people. There's I guess what I'm trying to get at is that it's impossible for us to withdraw from the world. We can't do it. We can't do it well. I would say that the monastics were the closest, and they didn't even do it. They couldn't do it as individuals. They had to do it as communities. We can't withdraw from communities, and I would say we can't withdraw either from the community that we have between believers and non-believers. It takes a lot of prudence and discretion and hard thinking to figure out how do we relate all of these different things. How do we let our principles inform the way that we deal with the world around us? It's really easy to kind of go in default mode and to either not process it or to just take things that we hear and just go with that. But we shouldn't be doing that. I would say we should be very intentional with the way that we do that. Intentionality and thinking hard through difficult things. Is kind of, if there was one lesson from all of these lessons that we were going through, that's one thing I want us to get. This idea that it's important for us as Christians to think through things and think through things well. All right. So I think we've got one more week of this. So next week I'm gonna jump on one, maybe two, kind of basic ethical questions that get raised. I think I'm going to do, there's a really interesting section in the Summa on usury. So as Christians, should we be okay with people charging interest? And I might pick one more. Because these are really interesting ways of saying, okay, we've got our Christian principles here. How do we apply these to the real world? How do we take a situation that we have, and how do we let our Christian principles inform that? And that'll probably only take 20 minutes to a half hour, and I'm going to leave the rest of the time open for questions, because I know we've covered a lot we'll have covered a lot in the last 6 weeks. So I want to give people plenty of time, if they have questions or comments, to voice them. I might have answers. I might not have answers. I might have resources that I can point you to. I might not. And then I would probably go and look for them and pass those on to you. So if you have questions that you can think of throughout the week on anything that we've done, please bring those. Chances are that if you have a question, someone else has that same question. That's like class 101 at school. There's no dumb questions. If you have a question, ask it. Someone else probably has that question too. So with that, we'll pray and then we'll be dismissed. Lord, thank you for this day, this chance to come together, to worship together, to be in community with one another, how you intended us to be. Lord, I pray that as we go through our week, that you would help us to just try to find the places where we can take our, what you've told us, the principles you've given us, the ways of living that you would have us to have, and help us to apply those to the situations that we find ourselves in, both individually and also as community. In Christ's name, amen.